try and stand on one leg and see just how hard it is to maintain balance. And now imagine that you use that one leg, not just for support, but also protection. The semiconductor industry, so crucial to Taiwan's economy, is also called the Silicon Shield and Huguosensan, a guardian mountain that protects the country, due to its geostrategic importance in global supply chains. So what will happen if it one day declines? Taiwan's National Development Council Minister Liu Jinqing has had this to say on the topic during a recent legislative hearing.
那现在我们政府这个的下一个富国神山这样的一个产业规划，我不晓得国发会这边有没有什么的一个规划，或者是一个什么想法，或者有什么启动？
我们有2件事在做了哈。第一个是强化既有的富国神山韧性譬如说我们在半导体的特用化学跟这个零组件的部分设备的部分，我们会去强化它的韧性。那另外一个是我们在规划更多的富国神山。其实台湾现在已经有多个，譬如 AI 是我们的新的富国神山，譬如说 ICT 是我们的富国神山。它有一个基准点我们用2个构面去看它。第一个构面是这个产业具不具备国际竞争力，已经具备国际竞争力，又有一定的市占率的时候，我们就会以它为发展，把它的全球市占率扩大。因为全球市占扩大才能影响到全球。
So to discuss the diversification, balance, and the future of the Taiwanese economy, we have with us today Professor Alicia García-Herrero, the Chief Asia-Pacific Economist at Natixis, and Michael Reilly, the former British representative to Taiwan and currently a senior fellow at the University of Nottingham's Taiwan Research Hub. Michael, in your past paper on Taiwan's case of the Dutch disease, you mentioned the need for diversification, and it should be also clear from our discussion so far. And we've heard Minister Liu talk about AI and ICT industries as a possible future guardian mountain sectors. Do you think this is diverse enough?
No. I very much agree with what Alicia was saying just before the break about the need to try to encourage the service sector. But one of the reasons why wages in Taiwan, in my view, are so low, it's a bit of a historical trend from the last couple of decades, or until about 5 years ago. The rapid rise of offshoring of the manufacturing sector from Taiwan into mainland China meant that workers, particularly sort of semi-skilled workers in Taiwan and workers in the small and medium enterprises that used to make up the backbone of the export sector, were willing to forego wage rises because it was either don't have wage increase or lose your job to the mainland. And so the magnet of the mainland, as it were, acted as a drag on wage growth. And if you can actually, Taiwan compared to places like Japan or Korea has a surprisingly small services sector. Services account for a relatively low percentage of the GDP for an economy of Taiwan's size. If you actually can increase the importance of the services sector, this isn't internationally competitive in the way that manufacturing is. So you can actually see wages, or you should be able to see wages rise up somewhat. And that leads into your question about diversification, and just seeing that clip from the debate in the LY. It's fine in theory to say we've got to make this sector even stronger to make it more of a shield and all the rest of it. But from the discussions I've had with people actually in the Taiwanese ICT sector, basically, at least until the advent of Donald Trump as US president, their view was that Taiwan was always just a few years ahead of China in terms of the latest technology. They accepted the fact that however advanced their technological breakthroughs are, it's going to leak to China sooner or later. So they always have to sort of focus on R&D and the rest of it just to stay that little bit ahead. Now, the risk for Taiwan of just focusing on this sector and building up, as was said, more focus on the support industries, the subsectors of ICT, are that you can't actually compete with China. Just look at the size of the two economies. Taiwan is an $800 billion economy. China's is a $19 trillion economy. And as we've seen, if China wants to get more engineers, more skills in its ICT sector, it basically just offers higher salaries, higher incentives to Taiwanese to come and work in mainland China. And you're not going to be able to stop that happening. It's nothing to do with politics. It's about economics. It's the fact that if you're young, you're ambitious, somebody in the mainland is offering you a salary far higher than you can get in Taiwan, then you're going to take it, even for a few years and before you go home. So this is actually, again, why the government needs to look at diversifying to reduce this. In effect, it's a subordinate dependence on China. They just have to have a more diverse economy, and that will help in terms of growing wages, a more resilient economy, and the rest of it.
Well, Alicia, we talked at length about the need to diversify the economy, but how could that possibly happen in Taiwan in a situation where everyone seems to be focusing almost exclusively on semiconductors and adjacent industries?
So first of all, I very much agree with Michael. As much as we think semiconductors is everything, it's still 13% of GDP. There's many other things happening in Taiwan, many of which are very inefficient. We need to recognize this. SOEs, state-owned enterprises, protected sectors, semi-oligopolies, if not monopolies. I mean, it's not only about forcing diversification, it's about allowing the economy through structural reforms to become more efficient so that other sectors can do well. As everybody knows, the semiconductor industry receives basically the only green energy that is produced in Taiwan, which is extremely little, unfortunately. It receives the water needed. It gets all of course, it's a very important industry, but we also need to realize that it sucks a lot of resources. Taiwan has around 4% of GDP in R&D, which is quite good, but most of it goes to one sector. So how can you ever, come up with a new sector, even a high-end sector? Think about the failure, in my view, of the biotech industry in Taiwan, which could have been a second sector. So because the resources are so concentrated, I think it is very hard to diversify. Thus, you need to increase the efficiency of other sectors so that the return is there for people to invest in those sectors. It's not only like shifting resources. You need to free resources so that you become more competitive generally. So I would say Taiwan needs to embark in a structural reform that makes the country overall more efficient. It's not only about this sector being wrong or right. It's about the lack of other opportunities.
Well, I want to stay with you for a second there. There are some countries, there are examples around the world of countries that were able to escape this trap and this economic curse of abundant natural resources, for example. And I'm thinking of Norway here. And of course, there are problems that the Norwegian economy is struggling with. Real estate prices are extremely high, but they seem to have poured a lot of the money that they earn from natural gas and oil into a sovereign fund. Is that a path that Taiwan could explore, or are there ways to escape this trap through these kind of measures?
So, I've been advocating for a long time that Taiwan should have a sovereign wealth fund, but this is a different issue. So one issue is that Taiwan has, going back to the inefficient use of resources, a lot of foreign reserves, but also in the private sector, meaning a lot of dollars, overseas investment in the insurance sector, in the banking sector, let alone the forex reserves, that in a way are underused. Why? Because they're only in financial products, whether it's U.S. treasuries or you name it, credit mostly for lifers. But, Taiwan has very little, obviously, diplomatic or political influence, very few diplomatic relations, but it could have a lot of soft power by investing in key companies, yeah, like Norway does with its sovereign wealth fund. So I think that would be a way to have different type of alliances, corporate alliances, if you want. And this is something that has not been exploited. That is unrelated to diversification, but it does sound like another inefficiency, that you have a lot of overseas assets, but they don't bring anything other than a financial return, and sometimes even a low financial return. So that's, but on the idea of diversification, some of the sovereign wealth funds, think about GIC in Singapore, Temasek, ADIA in Abu Dhabi, they also have domestic investment, not only foreign investment. So if you want to develop a new industry, I don't know, biotech industry, you could hook Taiwanese companies with key companies where you invest in the US or elsewhere, and try to develop a new high-end sector. This is beyond the service sector, and you could do that using your reserves and your investment appropriately. There's a little bit of that in Taiwan, yeah, but it's so tiny that it just can't provide enough opportunities for Taiwanese companies. So these are just ideas on how to use Taiwan's foreign assets more efficiently and more effectively.
Well, Michael, I'm eager to hear your thoughts on sovereign wealth fund and also other ways to kind of escape that trap.
So actually, first of all, I have to say that I don't think Norway is a good example at all. I mean, what you said about Norway is true, but Norway is a very, very different country from Taiwan. It's very big geographically, very spread out. It's essentially a rural country with a tiny population and massive oil reserves. So they do have this huge sovereign wealth fund, but they have also, particularly in the early years, they've used the wealth from oil to subsidize manufacturing on a massive scale. And they've done that essentially to prevent rural depopulation. If you go back 3 decades or so to when oil was really being exploited in the early years and they were generating massive income, if you look at the regular OECD surveys of the Norwegian economy, they were pointing out this apparent absurdity that Norway had aluminium smelters, for example, in tiny towns up near the Arctic Circle that made no economic sense, but the Norwegian government was unrepentant. This was about preserving manufacturing jobs in areas to prevent total rural depopulation. And actually, if you look at the exchange rate, it has appreciated hugely in Norway. So Norway, if you're a tourist, is an incredibly expensive country to go and visit, especially if you're a Taiwanese tourist. But also the service sector is extremely expensive because this is a sector where the government consciously imposed taxes. It saw the service sector as being unimportant. Manufacturing was sort of what mattered in their view. So services in Norway, compared to if you go to Sweden or Denmark, are incredibly expensive. But it can do this because it's got such a small population and the importance of the oil coming in is so high. I think a much better analogy, or 2 much better comparisons for Taiwan, would be the case of the UK at the same time, because it had a big increase in revenues from oil from the 1980s onwards. That led to a very high exchange rate, was coupled with very high and painful unemployment in the UK and even periods of social unrest. But the UK government responded with very extensive restructuring of the economy, deregulation, privatization. A better example for Taiwan, because it's more recent, is the case of Australia. the importance for Australia of iron ore and coal exports to China over the last couple of decades has essentially seen, it's been great for economic growth in Australia. They had uninterrupted, steady economic growth. Australians have become more prosperous, but it came at the price of, again, the rapid increase in the Australian dollar exchange rate, that effectively led to the end of manufacturing in Australia. There's now very little manufacturing happening in Australia. Now, in one sense, this is economic logic that the sector where you make the money is the natural resources, but is this sustainable in the long run? I mean, China is trying to wean itself off coal imports. It can go to Brazil for its iron ores and so on. And Australia found to its cost, when it got into diplomatic arguments with China, that this is very much a two-edged sword, a double-edged sword. So I think Australians recognise they need to diversify, that to place all your eggs in one basket, to use the saying, is not a sensible approach. So what should Taiwan do? Well, I very much agree with what Alicia said. It's a very highly regulated economy. The World Bank, until 2 or 3 years ago, used to produce an annual report on the World Competitiveness Report, something like that, that looked at most countries in the world, certainly about 150 or more, and took a range of factors to look at how effective they were to then engage in an economy's overall competitiveness. Now, Taiwan had moved up the league table, if you like, steadily over the years, but was behind countries like Korea, that it sees itself as a natural competitor with, certainly behind Hong Kong, Singapore. But what was more important, rather than the overall sort of assessment, was the areas in which Taiwan was not especially competitive. We've already talked about the difficulty of getting access to bank loans for the small companies, but there were other areas surprising for Taiwan. For example, the cost to a Taiwanese exporter of exporting goods from Taiwan was much higher than that for their Korean counterparts. And this was a cost of complying effectively or essentially with government red tape, government procedures. So these are the sorts of areas where the government, it could do a lot of deregulation, which would help companies. I mean, it's made a good start by basically it now complies with all the requirements for being a member of the CPTPP. That's a good start, but I would say that's a minimum. It should go further. We've talked about state-owned enterprises. The more that it can, if not privatize those, but at least corporatize those, to force them to actually make a return on their investments, if you like, so that they are more efficient, delivering better returns for the taxpayer. That would be, I think, a good step forward.
Thank you both for lending us your expertise today and correcting my understanding of the topic, which is my favorite part of the job, learning from experts. Professor Alicia García-Herrero from Natixis and Michael Reilly from University of Nottingham's Taiwan Research Hub. Which industries do you think are the best bet for the future of your country? Is it IT, manufacturing, agriculture, or TikTok dance trends? Let us know in the comments below. Click the video beside me for a discussion of the risks of relying too much on one part of the industry. And if you don't want to miss more stories on tech and finance from Taiwan, subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell.